Okay, so this is week 3 of MGT 6525, 6515 Agile Frameworks. Um, this week's all about challenges involved with scaling Agile to the enterprise level and organizational culture and the value and impacts of that. The one thing I did do, and all this list of stuff is I kind of curate this over time, but there's 2 new interviews out on PMI. It's called projectmanagement.com. It's one of the PMI assets. And one of them is with this Yannick Karu, who's talking about some of the issues of scaling and adapting to Agile. And then this is Jim Highsmith. I mentioned in the last call, Andrew, that Jim Highsmith is much more involved, and he does this interview. So if you're going to, go through here, I think it would be good to watch these 2 videos here. This one here, Craig Larman is the I guess he's the founder or co-founder of the large scale Scrum, which is the LESS framework. I think it's capital L, little E, SS, capital SS is the way they do it. And so this video is kind of old, but it's still good. He talks about the challenges involved in that. So we're going to take a look at those. And then again, like in the last class, I've got a little presentation here that if I can get to the right share screen, I should be able to switch. How about that? I switched. So we're going to talk about enterprise agility, scaling agile, and the cultural mandate. One of the things I did also learn this week is that PMI has published and Agile Alliance have published a enterprise agility manifesto. And it just came out in June, maybe end of May. And I haven't had a chance to look it over, but maybe by next week I might get it in here and we can talk about it, or at least look at it. So we'll talk about enterprise agility. So scaling agile requires more than just adding teams. It requires aligning the enterprise around adaptability and value. So as we begin week 3, we're moving from agile at the team level to agile at the enterprise level. And that's what scaling frameworks are all about. Most agile methods and frameworks were originally designed for small, empowered cross-functional teams. In that setting, communication is easier, customer feedback is closer, and the team can adapt quickly as new information becomes available. But the challenge changes when agile moves to the enterprise. Large organizations have more dependencies, more governance, more approval layers, more legacy systems, and more competing priorities. And that means that agile is not simply a matter of creating more Scrum teams or holding more stand-ups. The question is whether the entire organization can support adaptability. Can leaders make decisions quickly? Can funding adjust as priorities change? Can teams coordinate across departments without being slowed down by bureaucracy? And can the organization stay focused on customer value rather than internal activity? This is why Agile requires alignment. Teams need autonomy, but they also need connection to strategy, leadership, governance, and customer outcomes. So without that alignment, Agile may work locally, but then it begins to fail at the organizational level. So the main idea is that scaling is not just a team practice. It's a capability that the enterprise needs to develop. And team agility and business agility are not the same. Team agility delivers local responsiveness, but business agility requires the whole organization to sense and respond to change. And so here we make a distinction between team agility and business agility. A team can be agile in the way it plans, in the way it communicates, in the way it delivers work. It may use Scrum or Kanban or any other agile approach, but it may have shorter durations, it may have frequent feedback, it may have a good, strong product backlog. That's good team agility. But business agility is much broader. It means that the entire organization can recognize change, make decisions, shift priorities, fund the right work, and deliver value quickly. It includes leadership. It includes the strategy, portfolio management, budgeting, governance, operations, and so the whole thing, and customer feedback. This distinction is important because many organizations achieve local agile success without becoming truly agile as an enterprise. A team might be moving quickly, but if approvals are slow, budgets are locked, priorities are unclear, or departments are disconnected, the organization as a whole remains slow. And that's why agile transformation. So if we're going to become the common terminologies, if we're going to become an agile enterprise, we need to go through this transformation where we transform the way we do business. The scaled agile framework preaches that, but they have a way that you can kind of do both at the same time and ease into it. And that's one of the reasons that they're more popular than some of the others, because some of these other frameworks require pretty much a big major overhaul. But the takeaway here is that team agility is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Enterprise agility requires the whole organization to become more adaptive or more responsive. But scaling agile creates a paradox. The more organizations scale agile, the greater the risk of rebuilding the bureaucracy that agile was meant to overcome. So we just create an agile bureaucracy, a bureaucracy around agile. And so one of the central tensions is this scaling paradox. Agile was originally designed to reduce unnecessary complexity. It emphasizes, doing work in batches and frequent feedback and direct communication, empowered teams, learning, adaptive. So all these practices help teams learn quickly and respond to change. But when organizations try to scale agile across the enterprise, they often add new layers of structure. They introduce new roles, new planning events, new reporting systems, new governance checkpoints, new tools. And some of that structure may be necessary, but too much structure can recreate the bureaucracy that we wanted to avoid in the first place. And so this is where we need to be careful as an organization. Adopting a scaling framework does not automatically mean the organization has become agile. So I've done a lot of these transformations over the years, and I've seen this happen where they go in and they adopt SAFe, for example, and they get one release train working and they think the whole organization's agile, and that's not necessarily so. The framework can provide guidance, but it can also be another compliance system if we don't, we focus more on following the framework than delivering value. So the takeaway here is that scaling agile requires balance. The organization needs to coordinate across many teams while preserving the adaptability that makes agile valuable. And the key is to manage complexity without slowing learning. Enterprise agility requires enough coordination to keep teams aligned, but not so much control that the teams lose ownership and flexibility, lose that empowerment that they get with becoming an agile team, that empowerment. Excuse me. Enterprise bureaucracy can overpower team agility. It's kind of like what we were talking about before. Agile fails at scale when team level speed collides with the enterprise level bureaucracy. I've also seen this happen before too. They go in and say, hey, we're going to create all these Scrum teams, and they don't change anything. And then the Scrum teams just collide with this bureaucracy, and it slows them down. So one of the most common reasons that Agile struggles at the enterprise level is that the organization around them doesn't change. And the team we may be using Scrum or Kanban effectively, and we may be planning in short cycles and reviewing progress frequently and, adapting the backlog, doing all these great things at the team level, but we still might be surrounded by traditional enterprise systems. Approvals may take weeks. Budget decisions may be locked into an annual cycle. Work may be divided across functional departments that don't coordinate well. Governance processes may require extensive reporting before a team can move forward. And when all this happens, the agility runs into the bureaucracy, and bureaucracy becomes a boundary, an impediment, and the larger system or the larger bureaucracy slows everything down. So this is why a transformation just can't focus on events, like startups and stand-ups or sprint reviews. In other words, mechanics without mindset, basically. Focus only on the mechanics of being agile, but if they're helpful, but they won't overcome enterprise level bottlenecks and rigid funding and siloed decision making. So the managerial lesson here is that the leaders in the organization or the transformation need to look beyond the team and examine the system of work. If the enterprise is still designed for control and predictability and functional or siloed separation, the agile practices will be essentially neutralized before they can generate any real value. And so the key point here is that agile doesn't scale well when the team changes, but the organization remains the same. Horizontal scaling is not enough. Adding more teams without vertical alignment creates visibility. So we're creating teams horizontally, but without the vertical alignment, we get a gap between strategy and delivery. So it's a difference between horizontal and vertical scaling. Horizontal scaling means adding more agile teams. So we may start with one successful team, which is usually what happens. Start with one or two teams, and then we get lots of benefits from that, and then we start spreading it out to different departments or product areas. And this can be helpful, but this in itself does not create enterprise agility. And vertical alignment is different. Vertical alignment connects team level work to strategy, portfolio decisions, leadership priorities, funding and governance, and customer value. So it connects to all those, and it helps ensure that the work being done by the teams actually supports the organization's overall goals. And the problem is that many organizations scale horizontally faster than they align vertically. So they add more teams, but we don't have a clear view of what value those teams are producing. At the same time, the teams may not understand how their work connects to the bigger picture, to the strategic. Adopting a scaling framework can interfere with this alignment. It creates a visibility gap. Teams are busy, but the enterprise might not be aligned. And so we might have duplication of work, priorities, conflicting priorities. We may have local optimization and not alignment with the overall organizational strategy. And so in order to scale effectively, we need autonomy, but that autonomy needs to be connected to strategy. And as leaders, we shouldn't micromanage all these decisions, but what they do need to do is provide direction, remove barriers, and ensure that work is aligned with business outcomes. And the key takeaway is that adding teams is not enough. We need to scale both outward across teams and upward through strategy, leadership, and governance. And dependencies become a hidden constraint. At enterprise scale, dependencies often become the main obstacle to fast delivery. So this slide highlights one of the most practical challenges of scaling Agile, and that's dependency management. At the team level, Agile works best when a team can deliver value independently. A cross-functional team can plan the work, build a solution, test it, get feedback, and adapt. And the fewer outside the dependencies the team has, the faster it can learn and deliver. At the enterprise level, that independence becomes harder to maintain because large organizations often have shared systems, specialized departments, centralized approval, legacy platforms, cross-functional requirements, and one team's work may depend on another team's system, data, approval, or integration point. And this creates delays. One team may complete its part of the work, but the larger value cannot be delivered until another team finishes its part. And that means one team's done may simply mean another team's start. So scaling frameworks often try to manage this challenge through sophisticated and synchronized training or planning, shared cadences, dependency boards, program level coordination or release planning. All those things can help, but managing dependencies is not the same as eliminating them. So I know I've worked at a lot of these places. I've done a lot of these where we put together these dependency matrices and we know what teams in this, most of the frameworks have some kind of dependency strategy. Scaled Agile framework has a dependency board that they do where they connect it together and they have this coordination, this synchronization that helps. It helps, but it doesn't guarantee that it's not going to be a problem. So dependencies, the stronger move is to reduce unnecessary dependencies where we can. And that may mean redesigning teams around value streams and improving technical architecture, clarifying ownership, automating integration, or giving teams more complete capability to deliver value. And so the takeaway is that dependencies are not just scheduling details. At scale, they become structural constraints that shape how fast the enterprise can deliver value. Technical debt. limits enterprise agility, and enterprise agile cannot outrun technical debt, weak architecture, or slow delivery pipelines. And so this is an important dimension to our scaling effort or discussion. So when organizations talk about scaling agile, they often focus on frameworks, roles, events, coordination, all kind of the nice things. Those are important, but they're not enough. Agile also depends on the organization's technical foundation. So in the scaled agile framework, they have the architecture runway, they call it, and it has its own value stream, and they try to stay just ahead of the team and make sure they can continue to work. Some of the other ones I've seen, they have a system team as part of their, like, if they're doing the Scrum at scale or the less framework, they may set up a team that's just a systems team, and their job is to handle this technical dependency that we have on, our development environments, our network product testing environments, all that stuff. And technical debt here, we're not really talking about poor technology or bad decisions. The system may have been a state of the art when it was built, but over time, the business environment or the customer expectations, security requirements, integration needs, and delivery methods change. So a system becomes technical debt when it makes future change slower, riskier, and more extensive. So sometimes people think of technical debt as essentially a response to the decisions we make in the near, current term, and it can add to it if you make the wrong decisions. But we're talking about that legacy, the impact of legacy decisions that were made that at the time they might have been exactly the right thing to do, but now as we become more agile or as technologies change, it becomes less and less what we want to do. And I got light right in my face.
Yeah, I can feel
So
it.
it makes it hard to see the screen. Hang on. There we go. So at the enterprise level, this technical debt becomes harder to ignore, because older systems are generally tightly coupled. We have tightly coupled architecture or manual testing or slow deployment processes. And then we have fragile integration points that can limit how we can deliver value. So this is where the relationship between agile and technical excellence becomes really important. Agile teams need fast feedback, and they need the ability to test, integrate it, and release work with confidence. So if every release requires a long manual process, or if every change creates, unexpected failures in another system, then we can't really truly respond quickly or adapt quickly. And so this also connects to dependency management, because poor architecture creates more dependencies between teams. When systems are tightly coupled, teams can't move independently. And so are you familiar with the concept of coupling in software development type? It's where a change over here in one module has to create a change over here in this other module to work. So you don't have a, sort of an interface between them and that's called cohesion. So you want things to be cohesion. You want high cohesion and low coupling. That's what you want. And
Is
that's
it
how we create these DevOps practices and things like that. So
like
DevOps and what's
is it
that?
like updating a schema? Like if somebody integrates with your API, is it like if you do a schema update, they have to do an update as well or something like that?
If Well, the API is that interface between two systems,
Uh-huh.
and ideally you would have a contract. What they call a contract in I think it's a Java, that the object has a contract, so you don't change that contract. So if you try not to, but yeah, if you have say you have to make a change over here that requires a change in the contract, well, that's going to create that couple state. On the other end, they're going to need to change their system to meet the contract. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Would your version of cohesion there be something like versioning the API endpoint so they could still use the old one
Yes.
and transition
Yeah.
to the new one when possible? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So that reduces that dependency that we're talking about, between those two systems when you
Yeah.
do that. So the takeaway here is that um, the DevOps and automated testing, all this stuff doesn't really take away, they don't replace the agile culture. What we want is we want we want to create technical conditions that are needed for frequent delivery and planning. And so there's a term that I don't know if you've heard it, but it's called DevOps. Dev and operations kind of combine them together, and it's real common on a lot of agile environments to create that where you check in code, automated test scripts run, then there's, the code gets integrated into the trunk continuously, and then the delivery decision becomes a business decision in that case. So that it's tested, it's ready to go, and then we can decide if we want to deliver it, when we want to deliver it. So it's a sort of an end-to-end cultural type thing. So the key takeaway here, though, is that enterprise agility is not a management issue. It's also a technical capability. And without technical excellence, agile may look active, but the value delivery is going to be slow and it's going to be risky. So management needs to shift its mindset from control to enablement. And agile doesn't eliminate management, but it changes management from controlling work to enabling value. So they need to move from a fixed mindset, to a learning mindset, essentially. And agile at scale changes the role of management, especially at the middle management level. In a traditional organization, managers are often expected to assign work, monitor progress, approve decisions, and report status up to their managers. And their authority is tied to how much control they have. And they're responsible for making sure that work follows the plan and people stay in line with an established operational procedures. Agile changes that model. It doesn't mean that the managers are no longer needed. In fact, management actually becomes even more important at scale, but the manager's role shifts from controlling individual activities and tasks to enabling teams to deliver value. And this means decision making should evolve closer to the people doing the work. The people doing the work, the teams, often have the best information about technical constraints, customer feedback, risk, and delivery options. And when every decision has to move up the hierarchy, the organization slows down. The agile manager focuses on removing impediments, improving flow, supporting collaboration, clarifying priorities, helping teams stay connected to strategy. And so instead of asking, how do I control this team? The agile manager asks, what is preventing this team from delivering value? Which in the Scrum framework,
Right.
that's the main role of the Scrum Master, is to
Right.
do
Yeah.
this. Yeah.
Why
And
is why is the manager not included in the team in this case? And what I mean by that is, for example, if you take the actions that the manager would take, right? Why is that not simply just delegated to a team member? Like, I'm accountable for giving the updates to this person, right? That could just be a certain action that a person on the team could take without it having to be a separate role.
well, it doesn't say that the Scrum Master, you have a product manager on a Scrum team. You have a product manager on the team that they would be doing that, having that conversation with the team itself.
Yeah.
So in a typical Scrum team, I'll go back to the original way it was set up. The
Mm-hmm.
way that Highsmith and them set it up is that you have the team, and that's the people actually doing the work.
Right.
Then you have the Scrum Master and you have the product owner. The Scrum Master's job is to remove impediments, kind of own the Scrum process.
Right.
The product manager's job is to kind of represent the customer and be their proxy and work with the team as refining requirements and providing feedback back and forth with the team. And so what you're saying is certainly what should be happening is that individual team members should be coordinating and communicating with that product manager. Now, what's happened, some frameworks have kind of evolved that into what they don't call it a Scrum team, but they'll call it an Agile team. And in that respect, you still have a product manager, and you still have somebody called the team coach, whose job is to kind of keep the team going. But the reporting out it's more formal, where the team coach is more of a productivity kind of, has the team got what it needs to be productive? where the product owner is strategic and portfolio aligned. Are we delivering the right requirements? And those two individuals report up to the next level, which might be like in scaled agile, it's the release train level, and there's
Mhm.
a product manager. We have a product owner, a product manager, and then we have a epic owner. So there's that hierarchy there, and so the team itself is not necessarily reporting directly to the end stakeholders as much there as they would be in traditional Scrum. But your question's perfectly, you're right on right there is how it should be working. Now, if it's not working that way, then you're not really implementing Scrum in the way it was intended. And a lot of people, a lot of organizations do that. They'll still rely on the Scrum Master to provide this management oversight,
Right.
and
Yeah.
it's not really meant. That's not really what it's meant for. The team itself is supposed to provide its own management oversight. That's where it comes from, the self-managing, self-organized team. Um, but in practice, it doesn't always work out. A lot of times, some teams are so focused on technical stuff that they don't have that capability. And I think what's important, especially for scaling, and as I go in as a consultant, uh, it's important to kind of know how far away you've kind of deferred from the ideal, and that way you can kind of judge, how do I get closer to that? How do I, you might take it for granted. You might say, well, okay, we don't have, we just not, our culture is just not set up for this self-organizing thing, and to the extent that it's meant to happen. So how far away from we are from that, and what can I do as a agile project manager or scrum master? What can I do to move us closer to that, self-organizing, self-managed ideal?
Right.
So that's a lot of what I do. When I go in an organization, and especially if they're having problems, is I'll start with the Agile Manifesto, look at the principles, and I'll say, okay, how far have they deviated from this principle? And the Discipline Agile Framework has something called um, um, what's it called? Oh, I'll think of it in a minute. But it's how they manage things. And they have these things called blades, is what they call them. But basically, they'll say this is the ideal state, and and then they have certain states that you can go to. So this is where we are. Well, we can't go from where we are straight to the ideal state. That didn't make sense. So what's the
Mhm.
next state in between? I think it's called guided guided continuous improvement is what it's called, and that's how they do that. And that's I kind of apply that practice when I do consulting work.
Mm. Yeah.
Okay, so people matter more than frameworks. Scaling agile fails when we invest more in frameworks and tools than we do than the people and in trust. So this goes back to the agile manifesto of, you know, people over tools and techniques and all that sort of stuff. And sometimes when we go into a scaling situation, we just kind of flip that on its head. So now this is one of the core ideas. Again, people matter more than practices. There's an article, I think it's in the listing. It's called Agile Software Development, the People Factor, but it makes a point that agile success depends heavily on human factors such as talent, communication, collaboration, trust, and working relationship. And it's consistent with the Agile Manifesto's emphasis on individuals' interactions over processes and tools. And this is especially important when agile is scaled across the enterprise. Large organizations often respond to scaling challenges by buying tools or adopting frameworks and creating new roles or standardizing processes. Those actions, they can help, but they don't necessarily guarantee that we're going to be agile. And a framework can organize work, but it can't create trust. A tool can make work more visible. You can use Remedy Force or Rally or one of these tools, make it visible, nice dashboards and stuff, but it
Mhm.
cannot make people communicate honestly. Processes can define the meeting, but it can't make the meeting a psychologically safe or useful activity. And so at scale, the human side of all this becomes even more important because we have to coordinate across boundaries. And so now that gets politics involved. And people need to share bad news early. They need to be able to ask for help. They need to be able to resolve conflict, collaborate across departments. And if trust is weak, teams may hide problems, protect their own territory. You have a tendency to do that or follow the processes without honest engagement. And, it doesn't mean that all these frameworks and tools are unimportant. They can be very useful when they support the people. The problem occurs when organizations treat the framework as a solution while ignoring the culture and the relationship needed to make it work. The key takeaway is that Agile is a people-centered approach, and scaling Agile requires investment in people, trust, communication, and leadership. It's not just the tools. It's just not the package. And I've had to go in numerous times where they've adopted the scaled Agile framework, and they basically tried to implement it right out of the box without ever taking into account how it affects the people involved. And then it fails because people don't trust it, and they don't. And so you have to kind of go in and start all that over again and rebuild it. And culture determines whether Agile becomes real. Agile events cannot compensate for a culture that punishes transparency and learning. So here we're going to focus on organizational culture. So by this point, we've talked about structure, dependencies, technical debt, management, and people. And culture connects all of those ideas because culture shapes how people actually behave when they're under pressure. And Agile requires transparency. Teams need to identify impediments early. Product owners need to be, they need honest feedback. Leaders need to hear bad news before it becomes a crisis. Retrospectives need to surface real problems when the team can improve. But transparency only works when people feel safe enough to tell the truth. If your culture punishes mistakes or blames individuals or treats bad news as failure, people will naturally hide problems or necessary information. And they still may attend Agile events. They may well, but they will not use those events for honest engagement or learning. And so for example, a daily stand-up in a low-trust culture can become a status report designed to make everybody look good. And a retrospective can become in a blame-oriented culture can become a defensive rather than reflective. A sprint review can become a performance demonstration instead of a genuine feedback opportunity. And so this is why the Agile framework events are not enough. The same Agile event can either support learning or reinforce fear, depending on the culture surrounding it. A learning culture responds differently. It treats problems as information. It encourages teams to surface risk early. It allows people to discuss what did not work without immediately assigning blame. And that kind of culture makes adaptation possible. The main takeaway is that Agile becomes real only when the organization's culture supports transparency, trust, and learning. So the customer becomes the real boss. Enterprise agility requires shifting attention from internal hierarchy to external customer value. So here we focus on probably the most important cultural shift in Agile, and that's moving from internal focus to an external focus. In many traditional organizations, decision making is shaped heavily by hierarchy. Teams may spend a great deal of time satisfying internal reporting requirements, preparing updates for senior leaders, waiting for approvals, or protecting departmental priorities. And in that environment, the organization can become very busy internally while still being slow to respond to customers. So Agile asks the organization to think differently. The customer becomes the central reference point. The most important question is not simply did we follow the plan or did we complete the assigned work? The most important question is did we deliver value that matters to the customer? And this doesn't mean that hierarchy disappears. Leaders and managers still matter. Their role should be to support the flow of value rather than interrupt it. Leadership should clarify direction, remove barriers, make decisions faster, and help teams stay connected to customer outcomes. So now we're kind of looking at that middle layer of the scaling framework. This idea connects well with Steve Denning. He has an argument that the customer is not the manager. It becomes the real boss. And, for many organizations, that's a major mindset change. It means that internal authority must be aligned around external value. So for agile project managers and product agile leaders, this changes the way success is evaluated. activity is not enough, and compliance is not enough. Completing tasks is not enough. The work must improve outcomes for our customers, users, or stakeholders. So the key takeaway here is that enterprise agility depends on this outside or growth mindset, and you have to change uh, how it organizes its decisions, priorities, and leadership behavior around customer value. Scaling frameworks themselves reflect different priorities. The best scaling framework is not the most elaborate one. It's the one that fits the organization's complexity and helps deliver value. And so we got a comparison here of four of the most popular, when I mean popular, the most implemented framework. So when organizations scale agile, they often look for a framework that can help them coordinate multiple teams, manage dependencies, align work with strategy, and improve delivery. And this is understandable because scaling creates real complexity, but scaling frameworks are not all based on the same underlying philosophy. SAFe, or what's called the Scaled Agile Framework, is often used in large organizations that need more structure. It provides roles, planning events, portfolio guidance, coordination mechanisms, and alignment across multiple teams. And so for organizations with many teams, regulatory requirements, shared systems, and complex governance, this structure can be helpful. And this SAFe sometimes is where a lot of organizations will start with because it's more familiar. It has all the more familiar sort of things in it that their hierarchical approach might have. Less or large scale Scrum takes a different approach. Less emphasizes simplification. Instead of adding many new roles and layers, it encourages organizations to reduce unnecessary complexity and shorten the distance between teams and customers and descale the organization where possible. So this is a flattening of the organizational hierarchy here. Discipline Agile
In
takes
that
another
list,
approach. What's that?
can I ask about less?
Yeah.
Um, in less the direct customer feedback, like would they, let's say that only one customer has a feedback, would that immediately be transferred to a team to like go implement it, or would they have some sort of like still have some sort of evaluating process of like 10 customers have said this, 20, things like that?
Yeah. Well, they still have a backlog
Uh-huh.
that with features or user stories in it that they need to prioritize. And so there's a there's like a scrum of scrums they do
Okay.
in the so they have sort of a committee collaborative prioritization, I guess, and that's where that feedback would come in to get done. And it gets done. Well, the prioritization can take place anytime they do
Mm.
these refinement sessions, but you can, but like every couple of weeks, because it's Scrum based,
Yeah.
every couple of weeks, then the work can get rolled in to so in other words, at that planning meeting, we can pull things off the backlog. So you can change the priority and the team will take work into the team backlog based on the priority of the backlog. So does that make sense?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's how that changes get done. And it works the same way in the scaled agile framework, but they have a Kanban flow above it at the portfolio level that goes down. So
Yeah.
in this, there's not that direct unless everybody's kind of working at the same level. More like a big giant Scrum team, if you will. Uh,
Yeah.
the Discipline Agile takes another approach, and Discipline Agile is the PMI property. They bought it from the two guys that started it, and I think we have some videos of them uh, starting it. I wish I could think of their name now, but uh, what they do is you can choose your way of working. That's their kind of their phrase. Choose your wow, they call it, and it recognizes that organizations differ in size, culture, technical environment, and business needs. And so Discipline Agile is useful when leaders want flexibility and guidance for making context sensitive decisions rather than adopting a single prescriptive model. So like when I did a project, some work out in Sony, the Sony Pictures out in California,
Uh-huh.
and each department had its own way of its own life cycle. And Discipline Agile has a way to coordinate and become that kind of the API, if you will. We talked
Mhm.
about that earlier. Become
Yeah.
like the API for all the value that gets distributed around. So we're not really in, you could have a traditional project management team working under this discipline agile approach at this at the enterprise level. And the idea is that how we can coordinate all that through this discipline agile level. Now, Scrum at scale is like less in that it's Scrum that extends across multiple teams, but the scaling's through a network of Scrum teams while preserving the core logic of transparent inspection adaptation. And it emphasizes coordinated teams, shared priorities, and alignment across the broader organization without becoming overly bureaucratic. So it and less share a lot of the same kind of
Yeah.
approach, where Scrum at scale doesn't necessarily flatten things out, but it connects teams together across there. So this creates a decision. Sometimes an organization needs a more coordinated structure because the environment's generally complex. And other times the organization may already have too much structure and needs simplification. And in other cases, the organization may need a flexible toolkit or a Scrum-centered, scaling approach. So again, you have to kind of look at what you're trying to do if you're making this decision. And too many places I've been, somebody with authority just says, "Hey, this is what we're going to do."
Right.
So this is why context matters. The framework shouldn't be selected because it's popular, detailed, or heavily marketed. It should be selected because it fits the organization's needs and helps the teams deliver value. The takeaway here is that the frameworks themselves are tools, not solutions by themselves. We still have to think critically about our culture, the structure, the technical environment, and customer needs. And as we're scaling, the PMO, the project management office, we have something called Agile PMO. Sometimes it's called a VMO, Value Management Office. Sometimes they call them COEs, Center of Excellence, those things, but they should enable value to flow. So they're kind of where the main coordination of implementing our transformation goes. And so many traditional organizations, the PMO is associated with compliance, templates, reporting, methodology enforcement, status tracking, governance checkpoints, and those activities aren't automatically wrong. We still need coordination, accountability, and visibility. But in an agile environment, the PMO can't simply function as a department that makes teams follow a standard process. The PMO becomes another layer of bureaucracy. In that case, it can slow down the very adaptability Agile is trying to create. In the of the frameworks we talked about, the scaled Agile framework is the one that relies more heavily on this kind of COE or value management office
Mhm.
in a more more strict sense. In Agile, PMO should shift from enforcing compliance to enabling flow. And in some organizations, this evolved role may be called a value management office or COE or an ACE, an Agile Center of Excellence. And the name the name that's important because it signals a change in purpose. The focus is no longer on whether projects are following approved processes. The focus becomes on whether investments, teams, and delivery systems are producing meaningful value. So this means helping the organization connect strategy to execution, align work with outcomes, and make dependencies visible and support teams. So it's a valid, valuable role for a value management office or an agile PMO when scaling. And it changes the way how governance works. Governance shouldn't disappear, but it should become lighter, faster. So we have this concept of guardrails. So we want the team and the organization to be able to do the things it needs to do, but they have guardrails instead of prescribed processes. And the agile governance should ask whether the work is producing meaningful outcomes and whether the organization is learning fast enough. So metrics also matter. Traditional PMOs focus heavily on schedule variance, budget variance, task completion, things like that. Agile PMOs and VMOs should also pay attention to flow and customer value delivery, predictability, quality learning outcomes. It's just that they're a little bit different in how they do that. They can play an important role in bridging sort of the traditional need to report out this information, the variance information, while maintaining the focus on value delivery. And it can help Leaders understand what teams are delivering, help the teams understand strategic priorities, and help the organization remove systemic barriers. So we can help them. Basically, if it's right, there should be quite a few pain points that we have in scaling that the value management office can help address these systemic barriers problems that we have. And so the PMO concept doesn't disappear when we scale. It just evolves into something that goes to enable alignment, flow, learning, and customer value. The agile transformation itself should be iterative. It should be managed with agile principles and pilot, learn, adapt, and scale intentionally. And organizations should approach a transformation in this way. And a common mistake is treating an agile transformation as a large one-time rollout. Leaders may announce a new framework, train everyone at once, rename roles, add new meanings, and expect the organization to become agile quickly. That approach can create activity, but it doesn't always create real change. And I've seen this happen a lot when they roll out the scaled. I'm going to pick on SAFe here because SAFe has a very prescribed deployment process, how to deploy. I forget exactly what they call it, but it's a cycle, and they encourage this mass training and putting people out. And I've seen it cause this exact problem. And people don't necessarily become agile because we've just trained them on a framework. It takes some work. We can pilot this in an area with one value stream maybe, and we can see how this works. We can test it in a controlled way. So piloting the transformation is a good way to get some learning in place and see what resistance exists, what kind of cultural, organizational barriers that we're going to have before we expand it to the larger organizations. Inspection and adaptation are just as important for a transformation as they are for product delivery. We should ask, are teams actually delivering more value? Are decisions faster? Are dependencies reduced? Are customers receiving better outcomes? Are employees more empowered? Or are they simply just attending more agile events? Training and coaching also matter. Agile transformation requires a shared vocabulary. People need to understand not only the mechanics of agile, but also the values behind it. And without some shared understanding, different departments may use different. They may use the same agile language, but they may behave in very different ways. And then there's executive alignment, which is essential. Agile doesn't survive only at the team level. It doesn't survive at the team level if the senior leadership continues to manage through rigid plans, fixed assumptions, and slow decision making. So leaders need to model adaptability, transparency, and customer focus if they expect the teams to do so. So the key takeaway is that agile transformation should not be imposed as a fixed program. It should be treated as a learning journey. And organizations should pilot, inspect, adapt, and scale based on evidence, not just roll it out to everybody all at once. Some of the takeaways, the managerial takeaways here is that scaling agile is basically 20% framework and 80% culture, leadership, and organizational alignment. And so as we wrap up here, we talk about the main ideas together from a managerial perspective. Scaling agile is not about selecting a framework, but frameworks matter. They can be useful, safe, less, disciplined agile, Scrum at scales, and there's dozens of other approaches. They can help coordinate work, align teams, and manage dependencies and create that shared vocabulary. But the framework's only part of the solution. The larger challenge is whether organizations' culture, leadership, structure, technical environment can actually support agile ways of working. I've done some of these transformations before where we had to go in and we spent a lot of time just upgrading their infrastructure systems to support the speed of deployment and stuff that they're going to be able to do with agile, and change the way their release process works and get all that kind of that architecture in place for it. Culture determines how people behave when the process is tested. If people are afraid to surface problems, retrospectives are not going to create any learning. If leaders punish bad news, teams are going to hide impediments. And if departments protect their own priorities, enterprise flow is going to suffer. Leadership is also essential. Leaders need to shift from controlling work to enabling value. They need to clarify priorities, remove barriers, and support transparency and create conditions for teams to make good decisions. Teams need autonomy, but not isolation. Teams should be empowered to make decisions, but their work must still connect to strategy, customer value, funding, governance, and enterprise priorities, which is a little different than sort of the local single team. Now we're looking at the larger view sometimes. Technical excellence is another major takeaway. Agile can't scale effectively if the underlying systems are fragile or difficult to test, hard to integrate, or slow to release. Technical debt, weak architecture, and manual delivery processes can slow the enterprise. So the main takeaway is that enterprise agility or scaling at the enterprise level is a whole system capability. It requires more than just agile events, more than software tools, more than framework adoption. It requires the organization to change how it leads, learns, budgets, coordinates, and delivers value. So for future project managers and agile leaders, the key discussion, the key question here is not which framework should we use, but the better question or stronger question is what must change in the organization so agile can actually work at scale. One more slide here. So the real test of scaling is whether the organization changes how it makes decisions and deliver values. The goal is not simply to remember the names of the frameworks. It's more important to think like agile leaders and agile project managers. And that means asking whether the organization is actually making and changing the way it makes decisions, coordinates work, and learns from feedback and delivers value. So the first question, compare frameworks. The more structured frameworks that's safe may be useful in a large, complex, highly regulated organization where many teams need to coordinate work. A framework such as LESS may be more appropriate when the organization needs simplification, fewer handoffs. Second question focuses on culture. A framework cannot automatically fix a toxic culture. In many cases, it simply makes the problems more visible. And if people don't trust the leadership, if bad news is punished, teams are afraid to surface impediments, agile events won't produce any learning. And another question focuses on middle management. If the customer becomes the real boss, then managers must spend less time controlling tasks and more time enabling value. They should remove impediments, clarify priorities, support teams, and improve system work. So the final question is a traditional practice that may block agility. Examples should be, you could include annual budgeting. What practices do we have that block agility? Rigid scope control, siloed departments, excessive approvals, performance measures that reward local efficiency instead of enterprise value. And so some of these questions should help us figure out how we're going to do this. Which framework fits? How should managers change? What culture is required? What blocks agility? And how is value delivered? So agile scaling becomes meaningful when we apply the framework, culture, leadership, and value concepts to these decisions that we have to make. And so that's the end of the presentation. Run